Due diligence overview. This is actually extracted from an article that I actually wrote for the psdmagazine.com.au. It's called Profitable Small Developments Magazine, and it focuses primarily on property development. So in June 2014, last year, I actually contributed an article there, so they sent me a proof. That's what the article looked like. But what I've done from the article is that nobody likes to read that much, so what I've done is I've actually converted that article into a mind map, and I will go through that with you in this video. Warren Buffett once said, "It's better to be approximately right than to be precisely wrong," and this applies so much to due diligence that that you've got to be at least approximately right when you're doing a due diligence and you're trying to zero in on a suburb or a property. So when you do your preliminary assessment, what are the questions that you got to ask yourself? The first one is, who will buy the end product? Am I going to target the owner-occupier market, the investor market, or I'm just going to hold it and rent it out to people? So you got to start with that and have answers to these questions. What's already being built in the neighborhood? Is it townhouses? Is it apartments, or is it single homes? What is happening in my neighborhood? So we've got to go out and find as much information as we can about what's currently happening in the neighborhood. Who are the builders operating in that area? It is always a good idea to find out. It's actually usually no more than 5-6 different builders who operate in a suburb or in a certain area. Usually builders, once they get used to an area, they actually operate within that area quite often, so that they know the council, they know all the other consultants involved in that area. So it becomes fairly easy and fairly straightforward when you're actually operating in the same area over and over again. So you've got to find out who are these builders who are actually in your area. What is the design intent in the local area? And this is determining what kind of townhouses or units are being designed in your area. So for example, you got to go and find out if it's a 2-bedroom townhouse or 2-bedroom apartment, or 3-bedroom townhouses are better preferred than 2-bedroom townhouses, or 3-bedroom townhouses give you better rental yield as compared to a 4-bedroom townhouse. These are the questions that you got to ask for in your area. What is the demand for such designs in your area? So it's just back to supply and demand, and the way you can do that is actually go get in touch with the agent, ask them what's selling more, what are people looking for more, and they'll give you an idea, not only in terms of townhouses, apartments, or houses. They will also give you an idea of whether a 3-bedder is preferred, or whether they're looking for a powder room downstairs and an ensuite upstairs, or they want the ensuite downstairs and they want 2 other bedrooms upstairs. So that's the kind of stuff you want to find out when you're doing your preliminary assessment. What would be the end value of these townhouses and apartments? And you got to find out. You can call up agents. You can look at different resources. In my resource guide, I actually shared 10 different resources where you can get this data for free. So this is part of your due diligence when you start. What is the rent in the current market for a new townhouse versus an old property? So this is, again, when you're doing your due diligence, you want to find out if you are developing townhouses, you must know what are they renting for in that area as compared to an old house or a single house, or as compared to an apartment. So it just depends upon what you are developing, but you got to find out what are the different rental yields, and what kind of return different kind of properties or different kind of products are actually getting in the market. What are some comparable sales in the area? Again, in my web resources video, I actually discuss about different websites that you can use to get all this data for free, or you can pick up the phone, call your local agents, find out what's selling for, how much are 3-bedroom townhouses selling, how much are 2-bedroom apartments selling, how much is a 4-bedroom house selling for in your area, what's the per square meter rate in your area. So these are the kind of questions that you've got to ask when you're doing your preliminary assessment or your preliminary due diligence. When you're conducting your due diligence, there are actually two different phases when you do your due diligence. First is pre-selection, and the next one is post-selection. When you're in your pre-selection phase, these are the three main things that you want to look at. The first one is location. The three main things that I look at when considering a potential site are: number one, public transport. Is the site close to trams, train station, bus stops, freeways, highways, etc.? Everyone needs to go to work, and most Australians still rely on public transport for a major part of their commute to work. The closer you are to a public transport location, or your site is closer to a train station, the quicker you will be able to sell it at the end of your development. So location counts. Not only that, you'll be able to put it on rent fairly quickly as well. I also look for schools and education facilities. Younger families prefer to live close to schools. Again, this could mean shorter days on the market when selling your new development, or townhouses, or apartments, whatever you've got. Shopping areas, activity center, shopping centers, they all fall under activity centers. Everyone needs to buy groceries. Everyone loves to go to shopping centers. So you've got to understand that if you are closer to a shopping center, not only you'll have a greater uplift in your capital gain, you will also be able to sell it quicker, and so on. So these are the three main things, because these three things for me help me basically mitigate a major risk, and which is that if towards the end it doesn't sell, or if it's taking longer time for it to sell, if I'm in a good location, I can still rent them out. So that's a big part of the risk that I use, that I mitigate that way. Time to walk away. Do not look for a development site in Whoop-Whoopville, basically out of nowhere, or in a location that's recently being developing. So unless you know what you're doing and you have had some experience under your belt. As a novice developer, don't try and be the first in an area. Council can hit you with a lot of unnecessary infrastructure upgrades, which can kill the deal. So this is like a caution that you've got to be careful of when selecting location. Demographics. Determine the population and future growth of the area. Find out the age group of various households. Most importantly, does the suburb mostly consist of owner-occupied properties, or is investor-driven? Very, very important. You must understand who's in that area. Time to walk away. If during your due diligence you find that the suburb consists mainly of investment properties, that is, not a lot of owners live there themselves, stay clear. This has happened many times with mining towns. If for some reason you see a decline in population in a suburb over the past years, find out the reason why before you invest in that suburb. Gap analysis is basically the difference between demand and supply. So what it is that it actually helps you determine the gap between the demand and supply. And it's done by determining household growth, income, affordability, comparing renters versus buyers, and you can determine the demand in a particular area, and then you compare this data with the council's pipeline data for development applications to make sure that, okay, that's the current demand and that's the pipeline, that's the development pipeline with respect to all the applications that are already in council. And then you can say, okay, whether or not this area actually needs this kind of development. Gap analysis process. If you wanted to understand what the gap analysis process is, it starts by gathering data, and you can use ABS population, ABS income, and sales records, and the development pipeline. That's where you get all your data. And in the course I explain all these resources where you can get all this data. Demand analysis, you do analysis of household growth, household income, housing affordability, renter versus buyer, and disaggregate growth. Supply analysis, you identify demolition, you identify construction, and you determine net supply. And then you measure the gap, which is demand less supply, and you review historical sales data and fit product to conditions. So depending upon what's more in demand, for example, whether it's apartments or townhouses, that's what you actually develop in that area. Time to walk away. If your demand is low and you see a huge list of development applications on your council's website, it's time to walk away. You come across a site for sale with plans and permits for 2-bedroom townhouses, and your gap analysis shows that the demand is for 3-bedroom townhouses as the suburb is dominated with young families. It's the wrong product fit for that market, and it's time to walk away. So these are the three important things that you've got to consider in your due diligence process. And we go into a lot more detail than this, but this is just an overview for you to get an understanding of what's involved in the pre-selection process. Post-selection, there are 4 major things that should become part of your due diligence process. Determining highest best possible use, understanding the physical characteristics, determining the land value, and legals. Highest best possible use, it's about maximizing the development capacity of land or property while playing under the rules of res code, zoning, and overlays. Determining what the number of units, townhouses, apartments you can fit on a block of land in order to make the development viable. Time to walk away. Don't become adamant about pushing boundaries with council. That's a big no-no, because just because your feasibility does not show a profit with 4 townhouses, don't try and squeeze in a 5th one. It would only delay your application, and you could end up in VCAT in Victoria, or you'll end up waiting for your planning permit for eternity. So it could be delays, and all these things happen when you try and squeeze in more than what the res codes would actually allow. Physical characteristics are all about zonings and overlays. Is your proposed site correctly zoned? Usually for residential developments, you ideally want your site to have residential zoning. Examining restrictive overlays is extremely important. Some overlays are pro-development and can mean smooth sailing for your planning permit application. Size. Is the size enough to accommodate 4 townhouses or apartments, or how many? Frontage. Is the frontage wide enough for your development? You may have a fairly large site with a narrow frontage, making it unsuitable for your proposed development. Site contours is basically a slopes in the site. If the site's got if it's a very sloping site, that could mean more construction costs in terms of retaining walls, in terms of site cut and fill, in order to level the site, which would blow the budget out of the water. Flooding or bushfire zones. Is the site affected by flooding, or does it fall under a bushfire zone? If you're in Queensland, there's a thing called overland flow, and you got to make sure that your site doesn't fall under any of these zones, and that, because that will have an effect on your yield, and it may stall or hinder the development of your site. Local authority. Is the local council supportive of the proposed development? Have a preliminary meeting with your council's town planning department to gauge their attitude towards the proposed development. Time to walk away. Well, there's a thing called VPO, which is the vegetation protection overlay. If your site has lots of trees and falls under the VPO, vegetation protection overlay, and you cannot put your desired dwellings without knocking the trees down, walk away, because council may not permit you to get rid of the tree. which basically means you might not be able to build to what you are planning to build, because there might be tree protection zones where the council might not allow you to have a habitable space overlapping that. So there are all sorts of issues with that. Site history, research into the previous use of the site. For example, ask yourself, depending upon various use of the site, could the site have asbestos buried under the soil, or depending upon previous use, could the soil be contaminated in any way? For example, petrol, an old ex-petrol station site is a classic example of that. If the answer is yes, you either walk away or investigate further and find out how you can decontaminate the soil, and do your numbers based on based on what it's going to cost you to actually decontaminate the site. Now, land value, this is very, very important. Land value is a crucial component when conducting a financial feasibility. Usually everything remains constant, including professional fees, construction value, permit fees, selling costs, and so on. The only variable in a feasibility study are land and the end sale value. Just because you paid more for the land does not mean that you can get more for your developed product. So let me give you an example in this scenario. Let's say you are considering buying a land to develop 4 3-bedroom townhouses. You have determined that they sell for $530,000 in your area. However, the vendor is asking for $600,000 for his land, which pushes the price of land to $150,000 for each townhouse. Now, if you do your numbers right, you will notice that in order to allow for all costs and for you to make a profit on this deal, you really need to sell these townhouses at $575,000. However, the market does not allow that, as the current value sits at around $530,000 for your townhouses. In essence, you should be paying only $120,000 per townhouse for land to make your margins, which justify the end sale value of $530,000. If that's what's the case is, and you are being pushed into paying more for the land, you got to walk away, because there's no way you'll be able to make any profit on this deal. One of the last things in due diligence is legals. This is where you hire a professional lawyer, conveyancer to help you out. They particularly look into Section 32 or disclosure statement, and they find out the security deeds or caveats on land. They conduct property searches, boundary line or party wall arrangements, and other restrictive covenants on the site. Usually, even before you go to a lawyer, an agent will flick you a copy of the disclosure statement or the Section 32. Time to walk away. If you find covenants on your site, in your Section 32 or disclosure statement, for example, a single dwelling covenant, very common on big blocks of lands. A lot of people think that, oh, I'll buy this big block of land and build 10 townhouses. Apparently, it turns out you can only build 2, and then you are stuck with it because it doesn't stack up. So you make sure that you find out all these restrictive covenants that you have on the property. The covenant could be anything. For example, one of the properties that I own has a covenant of the dwelling type that can be built on it. For example, it can only be a brick veneer construction. Anything else, weatherboard or plain rendering, is not allowed in that area. So these are the things that you should know before you get into. I'm not saying that they would be wrong all the time, but you should know about them before you actually get into a project. So that's the due diligence overview. I hope you understand the various things that you got to look at, and the various questions that you got to answer and must answer before you actually get into a deal.